On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I have the pleasure and the honor of introducing our guest, a very distinguished guest who is going to be talking about a topic that I know is of enormous interest to this audience. He has been Ukraine's Minister of Education and Science since February of 2014, and previously served as president of the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and in 2001 he founded the Kyiv-Mohyla School of Journalism. He also served for 5 years as chair of the Consortium on University Autonomy. Minister Kvit was the recipient of a Fulbright Scholarship to Ohio University in 2006. He was a Kennan Institute Scholarship winner at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington in 2009 and held the German Academic Exchange Service Scholarship at the University of Cologne in 2010. He has played a very important role as a leading reformist figure in the Ukraine more broadly, and I think he will have much to say not only about education, but about the larger set of issues involving reform. So please join me in welcoming our guest for a conversation about Ukrainian identity and his country's outlook for the future. Thank you. So I might begin our conversation with a question that I think is on everyone's mind at this point, and that is the whole tension between the desire of the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian population, to move forward in a new direction, to carry out significant reforms in political sphere and economic life, in cultural life, including in university life, and the extent to which that agenda is now being impeded by the fact that the country has also been compelled to engage in a very serious military campaign against internal separatists, but fueled and supported by Russia. How do you see the government and the population managing to deal with both these enormous challenges simultaneously?
Yeah. Thank you very much for your question. And first of all, I would like to say that it's a great honor to me to be here today and to speak to you about all these issues. You know that maybe the most important question is what is the difference between Ukraine and Russia, and maybe Ukrainians and Russians. And we have a lot of different jokes in Ukraine about this. But I would like to focus on one topic, that when Russian invasion started in Ukraine, nobody was surprised because of the history of relations between Ukraine and Russia. It was history of genocides like famine, Great Famine. It was a history of different occupation, a prohibition of Ukrainian language, Ukrainian history, and Ukrainian culture, until to the ruling of Yanukovych and his government or his gang. That is why I cannot say that it was some kind of normal of our relations, but nobody was surprised because of Putin. I like the answer of McCain about his feeling. American journalists asked him about his feelings. He was near to Putin, and what he thought in that time. I just remember KGB, and that's all. You know, that is why it's a big tragedy, not only for Ukrainian people, but first of all for Russians, such regime. And of course, it's a big challenge for our government to provide very important reforms in different branches of our social life, of our economy, our university life, research, and so on, because we have really circumstances of the war. And you mentioned the word separatist, it's a very interesting part of our society because these people, we usually call them terrorists. These people feel themselves Soviets, not Russians who fight against Ukraine. They feel Soviets, and this situation is very close, very similar to situations, to circumstances with Transnistria previously, yeah. And this preservation of Russian public consciousness in some parts of Donbass, because we cannot say about all this region in eastern part of Ukraine. We usually call it Donbass, which includes Luhansk and Donetsk oblast. It's only part of this territory with terrorists or separatists. They feel Soviets, and that is why it's so easy to manipulate them. And Russian propaganda is quite successful among these people. But if we're talking about Ukraine, Russian propaganda is completely unsuccessful because Ukrainians, and first of all, how Ukrainians are different from Russians and why Ukraine is not Russia. Because of different political cultures, because for Ukrainians it's very important to protect freedom of speech and free media. It's tremendously important for our society. We have two, the biggest, the most important consequences, results of the Orange Revolution. First of all is freedom of speech, and the second one is real political competition. And it was a huge mistake of Yanukovych. He didn't understand that. He thought that Ukraine is just small Russia, you know, and all his activity was focused on personal enrichment, himself and his family and his party of regions. That is why it's very important to understand that we have completely different political cultures. Ukrainians during some centuries didn't have own statehood. That is why we have, maybe this is the course, why, I don't know why, it's my opinion, that we have a very ironical attitude to the state power. Everybody laughs in Ukraine on president or prime minister or government, and we have really good media and social media. It is very active, and we have really good news. I mean, good news from professional point of view on our TV. It means if somebody in Ukraine would like to understand what's going on in Ukraine or in some part of the world, he or she can get full information what he or she needs about this topic. We have free media, and it means different political cultures in Ukraine and in Russia. Also, we can say about some different cultural roots. And I understand that such attitude is very dangerous, and I should be very careful. But I can say that Ukrainian culture has more individualistic character. In opposite, Russian culture traditionally is more collectivistic. Yeah, and that is why it's also a big difference. And of course, you know that prohibition of Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian history, it was tremendously important part of Yanukovych regime to do something against Ukrainian culture. And a previous minister of education and science on this.
Your predecessor.
My predecessor, Dmytro Tabachnik, did a lot in this way. And I think it was not normal, and of course, the decision of Yanukovych, which was very strange. Firstly, he agreed to sign the agreement with the European Union, but in association agreement with the European Union. But later, he rejected this idea, and it was formal cause for the start of revolution of dignity, and it was a successful revolution. And I think it is also our problem. It's a big problem of Ukrainians that we can organize successful revolutions. I don't know how many revolutions we can organize more, and then to change our country and our society. It is important, but Ukrainians usually are focused more on the process of revolution. They would like to take part in the revolution, you know. But the problem is with results, and that is why it's the case and a big task, a big challenge for our government to provide different important reforms. And our reform, I mean reformation of education and research in Ukraine, I think maybe our ministry is until today more successful in this way than other ministries. But why? Because we started to work on our new law on higher education, which was approved last summer. We started to work on this law maybe after the Orange Revolution, since 2005. This is why we had a lot of time to do something, to organize special groups, and it was the will of the whole society to change our system of education and research. And today we are working on the implementation of this law. And all these efforts of our society, all these are connected with idea of the development of Ukraine as a part of the Europe. Ukrainians are Europeans, and this is the main idea of in different discussions, and this is the most important argument in different discussions. Ukrainians feel Europeans, and it was our choice, you know, and it is important also. I would like also mention that. A contemporary Ukrainian society is society of volunteers. It's you know, it's some kind of miracle that 1 year ago we didn't have any army, any secret service. We didn't have any police. In fact, everything were destroyed in time of Yanukovych regime, and it was according to politics of Russia and Vladimir Putin. And during this year, we created a really professional army, which is quite small, but which is the brave, and which is fighting against the huge army of the European continent. That is why today we are witnesses of very deep and dramatic changes, not only in Ukraine, because I think today Ukraine is a case of big global changes, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, from what you've been saying, it suggests that the effects not only of the Maidan events, but also of the war, the Russian invasion, has had as one of its consequences helping in the consolidation of Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian society, rather than provoking greater divisions within the country.
Yeah, you're right. Divisions. And it's interesting. It's interesting that I heard one lecture in Brighton, Great Britain, about the British people, And I was surprised that this professor told us about British people as people which includes French people, British people, people from Africa, from Asia, from different parts of the world, and it is one unit British people, because we usually had another approach from the Soviet period of time, and everybody was against the communist concept of Soviet people, because Soviet people is also something which was united from different peoples, but it was different concept. But today, if we are talking about Ukrainian society and Ukrainian people, you know, it's very common, it's very usual for the public opinion to look at the Crimea Tatars as a part of Ukrainian people. They, in fact, they are part of our people, and they are Muslims. And it's not so easy to explain this fact. For instance, I have had one discussion with one general of French army. It was summer of 2004, just before the Orange Revolution, and he considered Muslims in France in another way, you know, and he was concerned about their attitude to the French state and so on. But we don't have such concern because it's really part of our nation. And we have different facts from Maidan, first of all, where people who come from Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Belarus, Russia, our Greeks, our people, our representatives of our Jewish community, everybody supported Maidan. It's very important. And today, Ukrainian society is really represented is really political Ukrainian nation. It's so important. It was we can say about this fact as a miracle, but at the same time, I think there are some more deeper roots why it's happened in such a way. Maybe we have to consider this question much more deeper than we can understand today. Maybe later it will be more understandable for us than today.
But obviously it's a very positive development, especially in a situation where such efforts are being made to divide Ukraine between, and to treat, in effect, to conjure up images from World War II and to label part of the population and the government fascist and so on. To try to create tension.
And one author, one Jewish author, wrote the article about Maidan, and he used such expression that today Maidan is agenda for Jewish people in Ukraine. It was very interesting, and it was unbelievable. I believe in previously in our history, but today everybody in Ukraine looks at the state as something which was created by efforts of all our citizens, and not only our citizens. I remember Russians on Maidan, for instance. Even Russians on Maidan were with their national flags. Especially, I remember veterans, military veterans from Russia, and different students from universities, and it was really interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you would like to talk a little bit further about the whole issue of reform in Ukraine. What are the major priorities of the government as it tries to bring about these reforms, not only in education but in other spheres? And what are the biggest obstacles to these reforms, quite apart from the war itself?
Maybe the biggest obstacles is consciousness of a big part of not society, but people who are responsible for their positions as state officials. Because the post-Soviet consciousness is something very special. And very often it's very hard to explain different facts from our reality, but it's it's common not only for Ukraine, but for all post-Soviet countries. And I think this conservative consciousness maybe is the biggest problem. But if we are talking about problems which we have to find the solution to, maybe first of all it's corruption. And corruption, by the way, this is a common feature for both for Ukraine and Russia. Both. It's our common feature. And we have to understand this. But coming back to our relations between Ukraine and Russia, if to be honest, I have to mention one period when we had quite good relations, and it was period of perestroika, which started by Mikhail Gorbachev, and in that period we had on the common territory of the Soviet Union, really freedom of speech. It was really time of freedom of speech. And it means that, for instance, different intellectuals, dissidents, famous writers, politicians, everybody can say something from TV screens. And I think both peoples felt quite comfortable. I mean, in terms of public opinion and in terms of social reality in that time. But later, we tried to continue to defend our freedom of speech and our free media. And in Russia, it was Russians Russians went another way, of course. And by the way, today, Mikhail Gorbachev supported politics of Vladimir Putin. And it's very common in Ukraine, the expression that Russian democracy ended on the Ukrainian question. And it's very common for all of us to understand this fact. And coming back to our tasks and challenges, first of all is corruption. Because if we have corruption, we cannot provide any reforms, any deep reforms. First of all, corruption. And we also, what we have to do this year, the main task is spend money only which we really have which we really have collect this year. And it's very hard task because our state budget was completely inappropriate. And this year we are changing the structure of our state budget. And it is a very hard task for us because, for instance, we have to raise the price for gas in 5 times. It's huge, you know, and because people who are very patient, who took part in the Orange Revolution, later in the Revolution of Dignity, they took part in this revolution. They are winners. At the same time, how they can think how the state, what is the attitude of the state to them about these prices. But we have to do such steps. And I think besides corruption itself, it's very important to provide different deep reforms in our economical life. And reforms in education and research are also very important because the main problem with people, Soviet people in Donbass directly related to their poor education. And only we know that only 20% of these people had the opportunity during their life to go somewhere from Donbass, somewhere. It means only 12% went, for instance, not only to Russia or to Western countries, but in other parts of Ukraine. And this opportunity to have to go what people want to go and to have good education, it's very important for the development of the society, of course. And we do this, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what are the main directions of the educational reforms that you would like to see carried out and that you are trying to carry out right now?
We started, as I mentioned, we started from reforms of our universities because we were ready to do this. And I have one example, just one example. Before we start the implement of this law, we had 802 universities, and it's a lot for contemporary Ukraine with a poor economy. It's a lot. But today, a few months ago, we have just 317. Until the end of this academic year, until this summer, we will have about 270 universities. It means we are cutting the number of universities. At the same time, we are increasing the quality of these universities with different new requirements to the quality. It is important. And one more point concerning universities, that we have to change their structure, because Ukrainian universities, if we compare them to the best universities in the world, with Stanford or Berkeley or something, if to be honest, we don't have universities, because only a few percent of their activity belong to the research. And I think that at least we must have about 50% of activities of our universities must belong to the research activity. That is why near time we will change the face of our universities completely. And later, the next law will be on science and research. The next one will be the basic law on education, and so on, so on. And we have working groups. We have concepts. We all the time we are considering the activity and experience of different European countries, and of course United States and Canada and Australia. And we are very open. And one of the main tasks of the reformation of our education and research is to open our country and to involve our country, in terms of different parts of our social and professional life, to the world, to the global competition, if you want. First of all, competition among universities, competition among our economy must be competitive in the world, and it means that we try to open our country to the world. And one of the very important tasks is English language, of course. And now we are working on the special national project. We will organize summer schools in all secondary schools in Ukraine. We have about maybe 19,000 schools, secondary schools, and each school will have the summer school in English language for 3 weeks. It is important to focus the public attention in Ukraine to the importance of study of English language, because without English language there is no competition and there is no connection with the global world. And we have different plans.
Do you have, is there going to be a need for more instructors to staff these summer programs in English? Will you need to develop exchange or other kinds of programs? And are you encouraging people in this audience and others to help with this undertaking?
We have a lot of people who collaborate with us. Some of them are native speakers, but most of them will be volunteers among not only teachers from universities or teachers from our secondary schools, but also among good students and graduates. And I have a hope that we will organize such big project. And you know why it is so important to develop English language in Ukraine? Because this is a way to receive another sources of information, and it would be better for Ukrainian public to use English language, I mean media with English language, like BBC, like CNN, like different sources which are important for the organizing of our academic life. It is very important, and because unfortunately mostly we have Ukrainian and Russian speaking people in Ukraine, especially in our academic community, which don't have such access to this global information through English language. And they usually use, besides Ukrainian, Russian language. Of course, it's okay to know and to speak so big number of languages, so people want to know. But at the same time, it is a problem of Russian propaganda too. And we have to use different sources of information. Public information, I mean media, at the same time information which is important for the organization of our academic life.
I wanted to pursue a little bit further the question of Ukraine's economic potential going forward. I mean, clearly there are talents, there are resources, there is an extraordinary access to and use of computers in Ukraine among the highest in the world. Does the government have some ideas about how to develop the Ukrainian economy in a more diversified way, including to develop the high-tech sector so that Ukrainian programmers or computer specialists aren't simply working for Western companies, but you have the development of an indigenous high-tech sector within Ukraine?
I believe that Ukraine occupies the 4th place in the world concerning quality and quantity of IT specialists. And of course, we are proud of this. At the same time, this fact, we have this fact. It was maybe not according to the state policy. Maybe it would be against the state policy of the government. But today, of course, we have different ideas, and I think it's a big future in Ukraine for the agricultural part of our economy, also IT, and I believe that our Ukrainian weapon also is have a future for the development of our economy. We have different ideas. If we are talking about high tech and IT, of course, it depends on the tax policy in Ukraine. But today we have a lot of problems with state budget. We cut this budget 3 times. We had very heavy negotiations with IMF, and we signed the agreement with IMF. That is why I think this year we couldn't change our tax policy, but in the future, maybe 1 year ago, it would be possible. Of course, we have different ideas, and we have very good advisors, and we have advisors from Europe, from United States, and by the way, I would like to say thank you very much to American people, because all activities of American people concerning Ukraine is very supportive for us, and that is why I think we will do what we must do, but just step by step.
Well, I want to include in our conversation some of the questions that are already pouring in from members of the audience. And there's one that follows from this particular discussion, that here in the Bay Area, there are many talented Ukrainians working in the tech sector already. What are the educational institutions that are enabling computer technology and programming skills among Ukrainian youth, and how are these going to develop?
It's about our institutions in Ukraine.
In Ukraine.
Maybe the most important, our polytechnical universities. First of all, Kyiv Polytechnical University, Kharkiv Polytechnical University, Lviv Polytechnical University. Also, it's very important for this field, the activity of our Taras Shevchenko State University. And by the way, according to special research conducted by the IT Association of Ukraine, Kyiv Mogila Academy, which I'm working in this university. It is quite a small university. We have just maybe 3,500 students. But according to this research, we offer the best education in IT, the best education. But in fact, we have pool of quite good universities, and by the way, it is a phenomenon, Ukrainian phenomenon, that we have a weak system of higher education, but at the same time we have strong graduates, and it's another problem, and I can talk about this a lot too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's one question coming from a member of the audience who is actually from Kyiv University in Ukraine, and he wants to know, he or she would like to know whether during this challenging time for Ukrainian society, how can the student community support the Ukrainian government's pro-European vector of development? What should we as students do to improve our economic situation and our society more broadly?
First of all, it's a good question. First of all, the first period of Euromaidan, and we had 3 periods. The first period was related only with activity of students and partly our journalists. But students were very active because it was very attractive to them, the idea of Europe, that Ukraine is a part of Europe. And they are very motivated, and it was very visible the first part of Euromaidan, of Revolution of Dignity. Later, you know that real war started on Kyiv streets, and it was another period. But students played a very important role in Euromaidan. It is clear for everybody in Ukraine. And today, a lot of students, not only students, but students are very active. For instance, we have not only global problems. I mean, we have not only national problems, what we would like to change in Ukraine, but we have a lot of concrete local problems related to different universities, different schools, and so on. For instance, we changed the rector of the Kyiv Medical University. He was corrupted. He was like, very typical example of corruption within the university. His name is Moskalenko. And according to our legislation, it was very hard to change him on this position because you know that he was elected and he has a contract with ministry, and it was a very hard task to change him. And only through activities of students of this university we can change him. And our university only support this movement against this corrupted rector. And it's a very good example. And one more example, when we had the last period of Euromaidan, students who were active on our barricades in the center of the Kyiv and who fought against special units of police and who we armed like warriors from Middle Ages, with helmets, with maces, with axes, and so on. These students, maybe about 500 students, occupied the Ministry of Education. And it was their decision to find previous Minister Tabachnik and ask him. They told me that we would like only ask him why he did all these things. It was top news for that time in Kyiv. It was very interesting because when I was invited by the students, there was blog post on the before the ministry, the territory of ministry. And one student who was responsible for this position asked me, he was in helmet and with mace, and with David Star, this student was from Israel. And he came to Kyiv to take part in the revolution. He asked me in Ukrainian, not asked, but told me, Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine. And look at me, what will be my answer? I answer, Heroi Slava, glory to heroes. And after that, he agreed that I can come into the ministry. And, it was a student from Israel. His name was Grisha. I think he was born in Israel. Maybe his parents were born in Ukraine, maybe in Kyiv. But we can find him, of course. And it was decision of our students. It was very typical. Students itself were very active. The problem was with activity of universities as institutions. And in Kyiv, we had only 3 universities, Kyiv Могила Academy, Kyiv Polytechnical University, and a local university, pedagogical university of Hrynchenko, who took part in the revolution as institutions, and some universities in different regions of Ukraine. But it's another question, of course. Yeah.
So, in fact, again, this is a continuation of this question, but Maidan was started by young people, and particularly by students. To what do you attribute the strong Ukrainian political consciousness of young people? How do you explain the key role that they played in this?
Their political consciousness, it's interesting. I think it depends of idea of freedom, which was very popular in Ukraine all the period of our independence. Idea of freedom, of state independence, and at the same time, idea of freedom of speech and free media. And it's interesting that in Ukraine, state media which belong to the state never were powerful in Ukraine. Only private media or different independent media which belong to different, not political forces, but non-government organizations. And I think this generation was growing with idea of freedom in different meaning. And that is why Ukrainians usually are good revolutionaries. But we, as I mentioned, we have to change this tradition, and we have to protect the results of revolutions, of course. Yeah.
So another question about curriculum and universities, and this question involves sort of how does the how do schools in Ukraine teach history, and especially the period of the fall of the Soviet Union and the period of perestroika, and how is the teaching of history in Ukraine today different from the way in which it's taught in Russia?
I don't think that it's a big challenge, or it's not a hard task in Ukraine. We have some problems with our textbooks and with official interpretation of history, but I think it's ridiculous in our time to prohibit something. Like Dmitro Tabachnik or Viktor Yanukovych thought that they can prohibit, for instance, some period of our history. It's ridiculous because of internet, because of different sources, and now very often, if teachers, especially in Ukrainian schools, have strange interpretation of some period of history, we have full information from pupils or from students, and wide public very often become very active in these cases, and they have very strong requirements not only to teachers, but first of all to the ministry, and we have to answer them to these questions, and very often we change different directors of schools or state officials, or we ask teachers why they do in such way. We are in the process of changing. But today, Ukrainian society is changed, and it's very sensitive questions of our history, because we did not have understanding of our history during all Soviet period of time. And when I was a student, for instance, dear friends, most of all know the name Mikhailo Hrushevsky, who was a famous Ukrainian historian, maybe the first Ukrainian president. And when I became a student of the National University of Kyiv University of Taras Shevchenko, it was in 1986. In 1986, he was interpreted as a fascist. That is why I cannot get any book of Hrushevsky as a student, as a first-year student of the university. That is why the question of Ukrainian history is very sensitive, especially in our time. Mm-hmm.
So could you comment on what the Ukrainian government is doing to combat Putin's information war and all of these lies that he is spreading through the mass media about Ukraine? And what can Western media and governments do to assist Ukraine in this effort?
It's an interesting question, because I think that maybe Putin's propaganda is more successful, I'm sorry, in the West than in Ukraine, because it's ridiculous for us, but very often some serious people and our colleagues look seriously to the activity, for instance, channel Russia Today or something, and it's, to my mind, it's completely unsuccessful in Ukraine, Putin's propaganda, completely unsuccessful. Of course, we have some social groups who traditionally oriented to Putin's media, and especially among people who traditionally supported Communist Party or Party of Regions, but you know that in our parliament there is no communist, and I think it's also a result of the revolution of dignity. And we have some small groups, but mostly Putin's propaganda is completely unsuccessful in Ukraine. Yeah.
Another question that has to do with the status of Russian language in Ukraine. This is an issue that has been very much played up in the Russian media, the notion that Russian language is discriminated against and so on. Does Ukraine recognize the use of Russian as a useful concession of some kind, or is it considered damaging to the country's unity?
It is not damaging, you know, and it was a problem, the topic of languages. I mean, what is the role of Ukrainian language and Russian language? But this problem was not very deep, and it, you know, if we have different research, sociological research, before different elections, like presidential elections or parliamentary elections, this question of language was never in the top 10 topics. Which people, Ukrainians, were really concerned about these topics. And today, after the revolution of dignity, a lot of Russian-speaking people took part in this revolution, and the best answer is some part of Russian-speaking Ukrainian soldiers and volunteers who are very motivated to fight against Russian invasion in Ukraine, and some of them are Russian-speaking, and they don't have any problems in Ukraine. And I think it's not really a problem. The problem is not Russian functioning of Russian language, because it was the language of empire. The problem is with Ukrainian language, Crimean Tatar language, Greek language, and different languages in Ukraine of different our minorities. And this is a problem, and we have to find the solution how we will develop these languages. And by the way, we have and we continue finance special programs on different textbooks for secondary schools on languages of different minorities. And I mean that there is no problem with Russian language, because there are a lot of schools, and everybody can speak Russian, and there is no problem. I think this is one point of Putin's propaganda. You know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, again, this is a related question. How is the conflict in Ukraine being presented to the Russian public in the Russian press? And do you find any evidence of figures who are willing to challenge that picture of Ukraine that's dominant in the Russian media?
I mentioned the word ridiculous, and I think it's propaganda, but you know, it's more advanced propaganda than in Nazi regime, and which is related with the name of Dr. Goebbels. Why? Because Putin creates some kind of parallel reality, which is no exist, and we know that there are for instance, there are different examples from the war, which is absolutely unbelievable. they use different video, for instance, from the two Chechen wars, and with depicted different crimes of Russian army, and they show to the public as crimes of Ukrainian army. And we have different examples when such propaganda, such examples were showed but it was not took place in reality. And I think, you know, it's parallel reality. I think it's more advanced. I have to strengthen this idea. It's more advanced than in period of Nazi regime. Yeah.
This is a question that comes out of the Minsk discussions. What is your assessment of the results of this latest round of negotiations? And in particular, are there measures that you would like to see the United States and other European countries take that would be helpful to Ukraine?
I think the question of Minsk's negotiations, it's more important participation and process of negotiations than different results. Why? Because I don't believe Putin and people who represent terrorists, if they sign some agreement, they will not fulfill this agreement. But how we can stop the war? How we can take back our territory, step by step. There is no solution. There is no military solution of this conflict. And by the way, I think that we cannot say about crisis in Ukraine. It's not crisis, because first of all, Ukraine was robbed by Yanukovych and his clique and his gang. Then we have we have war on the Kiev streets, and today we have a war against Russian army, and we have effect of its invasion. And all our problems, and especially problems with and tasks, hard tasks related to our reforms, they related to the war. That is why it's not a crisis. We have a deal with results or with effect of the war. And I think that it's very important that we have effect of negotiations. And if we continue the time without active war in Ukraine, it is good for Ukraine. Why? Because Putin will not finance these terrorist republics. Because Russia doesn't need Donbass. It is destroyed territory, depressive territory. And this terroristic republic were established just for the war against Ukraine. If there is no war, it is against them, against the idea of their existence. That is why the fact of negotiations is good. The next step, some kind of agreement, is also good. And we have to move step by step if we would like to stop the war and take back our territories too.
Well, that concludes our program for this evening. And on behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you all to join me in thanking our guest, Minister of Education, Serhiy, for this excellent discussion, and many thanks as well to this wonderful audience for the terrific questions.
Thank you very much.